All right, let's go to Chapter 7. And members, we're going to plow through Chapter 7. And if we're going to take a lunch break before the panel starts in this afternoon, it's going to be a short lunch break, and we need to complete this in a focused order. By the way, Mr. Bardini, you've been sitting innocently down at the end of the table. We're starting with you on this discussion on the panel to get clear state policy from Department of Water Resources. Also, I think you should be aware that I have not yet had a chance to review in detail the letter you sent a couple of days ago. So and I think it's fair to the council, since this stuff has been flooding in and we've got about 200 pages to read, don't assume we've automatically picked up your comments from that letter. Okay. Staff has, I'm sure, but not the council.
I wouldn't assume even all of staff have read through all of the letters and
I was being
them.
at my most polite, Joe.
Right.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. Of course, Chapter 7, beginning on pages 245 of the plan, is about reducing risks to people, property, and state interest. We often think about this as being a chapter on levees because that's what we spent the most time talking about, but it actually isn't. Also deals with a variety of other both physical features like flood channels and bypasses, as well as actions like floodproofing and emergency response.
On the staff open issues list, there are 3 suggestions. They really deal with one issue, which is the not encroaching in floodplains. But there are 3 sections of the draft plan where the staff has suggested some changed language, and maybe we just ought to start with that.
Okay, the chapter, among the important narrative is a description of what we think we mean when we talk about government-sponsored flood control programs. Of course, one of the grounds for appeal is that a project has a significant adverse effect on a government-sponsored flood control program. So we've listed here what programs we believe we're talking about in that regard. And then there's 4 policies and 9 recommendations about improving emergency response and preparedness, financing and implementing local flood management activities, prioritizing state flood control investments, and that's certainly been a source of the greatest controversy in this chapter. Policy on protecting and expanding floodways, floodplains, and bypasses. The levees are there to determine where water doesn't go, but we also want to be paying attention to where we want it to go. Policy recommendations about integrating delta levees with ecosystem functions, and then recommendations about, those are primarily recommendations actually about levees and ecosystem functions, and then recommendations about limiting the state's liability for flood damages. And we have suggested revisions to the text of
Let's look at those. First is on page 274, members. 274, and it starts with line 1. It's policy number 3 under the title "Protect Floodways."
Yeah. This originates from discussions with the Department of Water Resources and also staff that assists the Reclamation Board, who just encouraged a little more attention to how that policy was wording without trying to change its intent at all. For example, they asked, what does future flood flows mean? What are you talking about? Because we spent most of the time talking about levees, these didn't get wordsmithed as carefully. So this
I did not understand from your open issues list whether you were deleting the existing language of that policy and substituting in full.
It would be replaced entirely with the language that's suggested in the right-hand column. And the changes to RRP4 that are identified on the second change have the same origin, and we think they have the same outcome. We're not trying to change the policy's effect. We're just trying to make sure that it's worded more clearly.
Let me know when I can ask a question after the chair.
I'm sorry. Just on that point, I looked at the new language and I said, well, okay. But then I got to the phrase, you essentially say, no encroachment shall be permitted in a floodway unless it can be demonstrated by a hydraulic analysis that the encroachment will not unduly impede. Any hydraulic analysis? I write you a hydraulic analysis?
So you would like that to stay, who needs to prepare the analysis by a registered engineer?
Floodplains and not destroying floodplains floodplains are the most important, most practical construction method in many cases to get flood protection for real people and real property. I understand some of the property owners would rather have it placed other than their property, but that's, when you're reducing risk, it's a big deal. But the ouch you've got here is anybody, that's what I read it, a hydraulic analysis.
We could, in general, we have not gone to the level of detail in many cases in specifying exactly what information has to be.
Well, but
this
is like asking levee owners to accept their declaration that their levees are either in terrible shape or wonderful shape based on no evidence that will be reviewed, if this is the language you're putting in.
This is the very language that I believe is in the Reclamation Board's regulations that cover similar issues, but if you would like, we can specify that it needs to be a report by a registered civil engineer.
It's got to be. If somebody came here and said, I'm going to drop 25 houses in the middle of the floodplain, and here's my 10-page analysis from Phil Eisenberg that says it's okay, and I blink and say, what do I have to do about it? Is it a valid analysis? Does it use scientifically rigorous evidence? Does the Department of Water Resources have to check off on? I mean, I don't mind the approach, but as written, it's an open window for anyone with any opinion, verified or unverified, to essentially say, well, I'm excluded.
So you would like us to add more clarifying language about how we validate that it's good information? Okay.
Well,
and both of those.
I give you my personal opinion. I defer to the council. I'm not in favor of encroachment on a floodplain, and I think the standard to do so should be as high as the risk involved. It should not be a low standard to violate a floodplain. It should be the highest standard. That's my personal opinion. But, and I don't understand. I did not understand from this new language what that meant. And that's why I asked the question whether it's deleting the previous language, because the previous language came reasonably close to being clear.
It's important to remember that in unlevied areas like the Cosumnes River floodplain, folks encroach on the floodplain all the time. You want to add a shed in your backyard, that's an encroachment on the floodplain. So we have people make, usually what we have with these situations is different degrees of encroachment require different degrees of analysis. And those are specified in more detailed regulations that would be adopted at a later date. But we can go through and describe more carefully the kind of analysis.
Look, most of the floodplains, like the Yolo Bypass, for example, has long-standing, 20, 30-year-old agreements and extensions and letter exchanges with the Department of Resources and, endless meetings and conferences on this, that, or the other thing. But here you're talking about, in our Delta plan, 2 floodplain areas, Yolo and the Cosumnes, and secondly, a proposed South Delta area to which this language would apply. And at least in the South Delta thing, you don't have 30 years of understanding agreements or anything else. You have 5 or 6 local agencies and state agencies who say it might be a pretty good idea and a rough boundary, and let's go do something. Don.
Well, I think Felicia was before me.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Just on this point, I understand certainly the chair's concern. I would just speak a bit from experience in the Cosumnes Comey floodplain, particularly the Sacramento County portion. I think, as Dan just correctly pointed out, is that you've had, very little encroachment as it relates to permanent structures. But from time to time, somebody has built a barn out there. They have built silos. There have been a few houses, but a couple of the houses that have been built have been ones where property owners, in actuality, I know in 2 cases, have sold significant portions of their land to the Conservancy where levees have been breached, some low-lying levees that allow for expansion, actually, of the a floodplain come to a more natural state. And I guess I would hate to see where if somebody, under certain circumstances, again, not to drop 25 houses into the floodplain, but would come in and have an encroachment that would seem to fit with the overall pattern for protecting the floodplain, we'd have to have some engineered analysis about, what the hydraulic upstream, on the Cosumnes all the way down to the bay, the impacts are going to be before they could do that. And so I think there needs to be some reasonable application. And I guess I saw the language here as not being so onerous that it was going to require a level of analysis that probably would be nearly impossible, at least practically speaking, but also would, I think, send a message about being clear about the importance of prohibiting encroachments that would, take up either current and future flood capacity. So I guess that was my thought, and I thought that the language goes a little further than even the initial language, because it says, no encroachment versus, I think the shall not be encroached upon in the language in the sixth draft. So, again, I don't know that I go as far with this as certainly the chair with respects to the hurdles that you put there. On the other hand, I certainly recognize the importance of maintaining those floodplain areas. So.
Okay.
Question?
Felicia.
Can you just describe to me a little bit more of what's meant here by that the encroachment would have a significant impact on floodplain values if there's a standard? I mean, I'm familiar with this in terms of the Army Corps and being in a flood basin and having to, trying to expand a treatment plant and having to excavate enough earth and raise a berm so that there was no net change in the carrying capacity of the basin. But it doesn't say that here. So I'm wondering what the standard is and then how you assess the ecological value forbearance issue. Sort of how we're going to, I just want to understand how we're going to judge this, or if there's a metric to be used on both counts, both the flood impact and the ecological value impact.
The standard is significant impact, so that's been defined through common law, and I'd refer to our attorney for a more detailed explanation if that's necessary. I think, again, the determinations will be being made initially by the agencies that are, approving the proposed action and following the consistency certification. In my experience, people do that based on engineering analyses that's submitted as part of some sort of environmental document or application. A challenge in this situation that is a little bit unusual is the provision of ecosystem benefits. What's implied by that? If I was completing that kind of certification, I'd look at what the values of the floodplain were. Was it just flood accommodation? Was it, in which case you'd also be getting some of the values of increased productivity while the flood's in that transitory storage stage? But in other cases, you might actually have situations where the habitat values of the floodplain itself were essential because it was forested in some kind of way or providing areas that were used by cranes during winter periods or migratory waterfowl. And so you would do an evaluation of that too. I hate to try to specify today what kinds of considerations might apply to any particular piece of parcel. Like this is a progress over the way these issues are normally evaluated, because typically it would just be an engineering analysis. It would only look at flow impedance and perhaps transitory storage and wouldn't consider the natural values as well. In general, these I believe this is language, and I wasn't involved in crafting this, so I'd have to defer to others on our staff if you want more detail. But I believe this language was developed in consultation with the staff of the Flood Protection Board, who uses similar language routinely in making recommendations to their oversight board.
Randy. Okay, Mr. Bardini.
Drum roll. I was going to try to get away with no comment, but
no, don't. You won't get by with
not
that
this
one.
time.
Phil, maybe I could back up just one, because I forgot to point out the final recommended change, and this was in response to comments from Dr. Pike about the proposal we had made regarding changes in state law that would help give state agencies the same immunity.
This is number 3 in the list.
The same immunity from damage to claims with regard to flood liability that federal agencies enjoy. And I think he pointed out that in this case of some of the damages that have been assessed against the state, they're actually damages under the federal Constitution for inverse condemnation. And so in that case, of course, the state law could address those issues. So we've revised the language as we've shown to try to clarify what we think maybe can't be accomplished with that sort of approach.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, in all seriousness, I think this is an area where the department has a lot of comment on in terms of the importance of this this subject. I think I'd like to touch on 3 main things in my comments. One is just talk generally about the letter submitted by the department on the 13th. Secondly, talk a little bit more specifically about risk reduction. And then last, I'd like to talk about the finance, which is pivotal to a lot of our conversation. I know you have a follow-up in the afternoon. Let's talk first about the general comments that the department's made on the plans. And I think, one, we really feel that the committee of agencies and how we improve alignment and interaction is pivotal. And we think moving forward, that'll be key. And I think we should remember that is probably easier said than done among entities, but I think that is a clear moving forward focus that we need to remember. The second one is talk about the objectives of the co-equal and meeting that goal. It's the view, and I'm speaking as the deputy of integrated water management. It's our belief that the integrated water management, the implementing in an integrated water management approach is how you're going to meet the co-equal goals. And primary to that is public safety, environmental stewardship, and economic stability. And there's a number of management actions that we do in integrated water management that will help meet the goals of co-equal. And a lot of integrated water management is how we interact in the how, which is from state, federal government, and local government partnership in the implementation. So we view that integrated water management is absolutely a necessity and the ability to meet the goals of co-equal. The third thing that our letter we touched on is climate change, and we all recognize that's been quite a challenge over the last decade in terms of getting over it. It's something we've seen even prior to that in the hydrologic record in terms of climate variability and change. There's been a number of things of executive orders, Assembly Bill 32, SB 375, all of these have been identified in the letter, have been some of the basis of state policy on how we handle that. It'll continue to evolve. We recommend that the Stewardship Council with the department and other state agencies will continue to build on that climate change body of work and moving forward. The fourth thing we talked about in our letter is the support of excluding the year-to-year transfers, and we think moving and continuing that practice would be good. The other part we talked about is the reduced alliance and the fact that the department is the exporter and the transporter of water, and there's a number of agencies and service agencies, and so how the department is one of the primary operators, but with all our entities, and how far you go with where that reduced reliance. And again, it's something we'll work with the Stewardship Council on. The sixth thing is we feel that the plan is workable. We obviously have a lot of our interpretations based on existing laws and statutes that were summarized in the letter. We feel based on those statutes that we should be able to work, or the plan is implementable based on that. We did talk a little bit about CEQA and the fact that a lot of things already processes in place in CEQA and current environmental protection laws and et cetera really provide a lot of the procedural processes in here. And so we look to that to handle a lot of the procedural aspects of meeting the consistency determinations. And then lastly, we talk about the flood protection prioritization. And I think our view on this one is that we have changing conditions all the time, and a prioritization will have to evolve as they're changing conditions. So as much as we may have an investment approach today, that same approach down the road may change, as again, so many things are occurring. The science is changing, the system is changing. We talked about climate change a little bit, so there's a number of things that we know that we have an evolving system out there, and so what we think we can do or where we're at in terms of prioritization today may be different down the road. So those are the main points that were in the letter that the department presented. We thought it hopefully would be helpful in just a general overview, but in general we are positive on what we've seen. And
okay, Randy? No. All right. Mr. Zlotnick?
I have
I'm
two more
sorry.
points.
Two more points. Okay.
I just hit the first one. So that's our general comment. So I want to talk now a little bit more specific to the risk reduction side and really the Chapter 7. And then I do want to end it with the finance discussion a little bit about the realities of what we see, and I'd like to maybe bring that in some context of the discussion, not only for Chapter 7, but really moving forward to Chapter 8 conversation. Let's talk risk reduction. I think there's a number of things in this chapter that I think are very consistent to what the department has been doing ongoing and will continue to do. We've talked about the aspects of delta conditions and understanding that. We completely concur with that and continue to press that understanding. It's a lot of work that's been done. A number of body of efforts have been done, starting from DREAMS, Delta Risk Management, to the other efforts that we've done as a department broadly to our levy evaluations work. It's important to know the conditions of it so you can actually properly decide where the risks are and how to make improvements. Second part is hydrologic updates and essentially routing. Essentially, the Central Valley Flood Plan has done a number of efforts to do that. More importantly, we have a huge effort that we've been doing with the Corps of Engineers and the department in terms of updating the hydrology and modeling tools through the system. So that, again, is a part of the evolution of improvement of tools to be able to do analysis. We support that. But the big one is the economic analysis and how do you characterize that. And that's been the one of essentially, we've done a number of products, one for the water board, actually, and then we have our body of work that's described in the Central Valley Flood Plan. I think at the end of the day is you can get the economists in the room, and we have a stack of theories and aspects and concepts. And the reality is the application of economic theory to the problem you're trying to solve and to the types of programs you're trying to implement. In summary, what the benefits are and what we do in integrated water management is what we're trying to do is very simple, is to avoid social disaster. That body of work and benefits is to avoid the social disaster. And how we're willing to do this as a society and what we want to invest towards that and how best to mitigate that is really the issue. So at the end of the day, it's either avoiding the economic collapse of a region or avoiding the disaster of public safety or the decline of a species or the sustained economics to the state of the economy is what we're trying to do as a whole. And that economic theory is all tied to avoiding that disaster. And then from there, it's how do we want to proceed with that theory and how do we design qualitatively in some cases or quantitatively, depending on what it is, in programs that try to avoid that disaster. And I think that's what we've done across agencies, the different people with their mandates. And again, there's not going to be just one formula that fits all and it solves it out. It's not quite that simple. So just lead that in the risk characterization. So we know in the case of, let's say in the Delta specific, we know there are regional aspects that we're considering in our ability of investment and where that social disaster we want to avoid, but we also know there's a system side. So the question is, where does the system, how much is the system considerations, how much is the regional, and that's the part that we need to work through. So in a nutshell, what we want to do with that principles and with that foundation, then where is the investment, where's the priority? So in the case of the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, we put in what we call the state system investment approach. And I guess the issue is then we've got a little bit of that in the Delta, but the reality is let's get the rest of the Delta and what's our approach, and that's something we look forward to working with the Stewardship Council on.
And complicated by the fact we've got the project, non-project distinction,
Absolutely.
where it is more clear, at least with project levies, that there's a legal obligation that covers the state and the federal government.
That's correct.
Yeah.
So let's lastly talk about the big one, which is finance. This is the hard pill to swallow. The fact is that when you look at infrastructure for water management as a whole, I would say that over the next 20 to 30 years, by any estimate, it's about $100 billion of investment is required. Significant dollars.
State water project?
State, everything. I'm just talking as the
Everything.
whole state of California, from public safety to trying to preserve the environment to the aspects of how we do water reliability in the state. The investment of that bill over the next, and this is something we'll continue to shape under the California Water Plan and a lot of the other processes that we currently have, working with all our partner agencies. But I can tell you right now, the public safety investment alone is somewhere in the neighborhood of $40 billion statewide. So that's just public safety. But again, it has to be implemented in an integrated approach. So when you look at it, it's a very big price tag that we have in the state of California. So for me, the financing really starts at the top about what we broadly have to do for all the aspects of the state to preserve the environment, to preserve the economy, and to preserve public safety. So we have a significant problem, I think, as the state of California, working with local agencies and federal. Now, I think it's not any news that austerity has been the word, and of course it's been heavily at the federal government level, and the state has been struggling with that. So we recognize moving forward that we're going to have to basically articulate that need heavily on a public basis, truly understand that here are the kind of management actions we believe are required to basically do it, and I can tell you it's going to be a portfolio of a diverse suite of management actions to try to put that investment in place to deal with those three major objectives I've talked about in IWM. And then lastly, it's the how, and the how is essentially a partnership between federal, state, and local agencies, which require a lot of alignment to be able to do it so the transactional costs are down and our ability to implement is timely, which is what the public is looking for, and it gets back to what Felicia was saying about accountability. So it's not enough to have the money, it takes alignment too. And I think the alignment requires an integrated water management approach, and then we'll have success. But we still got to highlight the problem. So at the end, let's talk about finance specific. In the water management world, typically local agencies pay a lot more for the water reliability type of stuff, water agencies, and then essentially the federal and state provide additional support depending on, usually from a system perspective. In the case of public safety, it's heavier in the federal state financing, typically up to 90%. So essentially you do have a difference on where the federal state comes in terms of what entity is funding. So one of the things I would probably, in the next foreseeable future, with the federal government, its austerity, that burden is being picked up right now under current, bond monies that are available by the state. And right now we are struggling to obtain federal funding moving forward. So this is going to be a challenge.
Your Central Valley flood plan preliminary
Right.
discussed this issue, and it included a chart of anticipated financing sources.
Yep.
46% state, 46% federal government, and then 8% local. And then it said, of course, the federal money is declining, so we don't really expect to get this federal 46% either. What does the department see realistically? Forget for a minute
Yes.
of what's contained in being in the general risk category of spending. If the feds are backing away from their most recent historical level of spending, and boy, the state news on budgetary stuff is not good,
right.
And the use of general obligation bonds to finance capital infrastructure, the legislature now seems to be aware that the payment for the bonds comes from the general fund, and that seems to affect education and health care and all the other things. So they're skeptical. What's the department realistically see?
Well, I think the first thing is we're going to have to really stress the overall issue to the public about what's at stake in water management. So we don't start there. You can't lobby federal, state, or local funding. So we have to get the awareness up. That's one of the things that we are going to be trying diligently, not that we haven't, but certainly these will be elevated in a number of forms moving forward. That's going to be the first thing you're going to need to get any action. The second thing is at the federal level, what you're trying to do is maximize the existing programs that are in there, but I think we're going to have to look to future programs that are different than the current conventions. And my view is that if, to the extent that you can say that you have better alignment between federal, state, and local agencies and better clarity of the management actions that need to be done, the more likely you'll get the public support for the financing of those items.
What does better alignment mean?
Well, a couple of things. So one of the issues that we have, and it's broad, but essentially there's system management that generally the federal and state government are doing across regional areas. And the question is where the priority needs to be on that has to come together. And then the second part, how regional agencies work together. So we've done, under the department, the Regional Integrated Water Management, where we bring a lot of agencies together. So you've got a lot more clarity of where regionally folks say this is where the investments need to be made. And conversely, we look at it from all the regions where the federal and state interest is to help support those efforts. So that's really key. And hopefully through that process, it'll be much clearer to get the public support about moving forward with a given management action.
Back up, if you would. I think you said when you started that financing for system availability is largely local, and then other categories of spending are where the feds and the state, and that's emergency response and risk reduction and stuff like that, and in later decades, maybe even some environmental stuff, is largely where you get state and federal money involved. Is that pattern likely to be true into the future, that the local agencies, whether they fund the State Water Project or the CVP, that's system availability, right?
Yeah,
Is that
what,
go- is that
yeah, what
gonna
I was trying to
change?
say is water agencies, water reliability projects historically were done by the activism of a given water agency, or in some cases grouped together under, let's say, the federal state project. Generally, those are much more financed by the regional beneficiary, and the state and federal government provided some additional support above it. That's been the history. I think the difference is, I'm just kind of giving the history of where they're grouping and what local, federal, and state were funding. The interesting thing that I think moving forward, though, at the federal level and the state, it's to do it on a single purpose, saying it's going to be just for public safety. Those days are gone. If it's not integrated water management, and this kind of policies have been laid out by the federal government, it's implementing has been the trick. So what folks need, where this has to come, is that all of these things have to come together in one kind of financing strategy under an integrated approach versus saying we're going to try to fund it under a cost share ratio for this single objective or purpose. So that's the change that I see is happening. It's been happening, but the ability to do it or how we do it is really the issue. And we're having that conversation, I think, at all levels of government.
Felicia?
I'm sorry. I'm just trying to figure out how to implement that. I have some other questions after we hear from the panel. That to augment the prioritization policy we have here, or other places to indicate that. I agree with you because I've seen the separation of state, federal, and local, including in emergencies, and it takes a lot of work to make it work. And if you're doing your emergency planning, deciding what the most important emergencies are, then, as I'm hearing you, then you can have joint funding discussions to try and figure out how to get the most important things done, which is the only way we have a shot at doing this. And even in some of our earlier meetings where we had federal and state folks side by side, it was clear that they saw different priorities. And so one of the things we may need to give a little more direction on, and I'll get to this in my questions, is, there obviously public safety comes first.
Sure.
But how do you handle the issue of, for example, those levees whose breach will have salinity flooding into we'll deal with water south? I mean, part of our challenge here is we're supposed to think about the interests of all Californians versus the people who happen to be in a room on any given separate policy, all well-intended, but only. So the opportunity here is to kind of pull it all together and look at it and apply the integrated kind of planning that people are starting to do at all levels. And I appreciated what you said about the feds have been talking about it, but they haven't done it yet. And it's always good to at least start talking about it. But there is a real opportunity to pull it together. So any specific recommendations you can make to language that we already have in here to help flesh out that concept, but also how we implement it would be really helpful.
Okay. We'd love to help you.
Pat, did you have no? Don? All right.
That's it.
Thank you, Mr. Wilcox. Mr. Zlotnick?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of comments. First, specifically with regard to the proposed changes in RRP 3 and 4, and maybe the intent, Dan, was that it's implicit, but in both of them you took out the word mitigating. So it reads as if it either does or doesn't.
You would like it reinserted with the word full in front of it?
No.
No.
So was that intended, Dan, or?
Yeah, I think the point of these, one of the ways you might, a hydraulic analysis might demonstrate, for example, that an encroachment isn't going to unduly impede on the free flow of water in a floodway would be by identifying mitigation. It could be that, for example, Caltrans is improving the I-80 bridge across the Yolo bypass, and they can demonstrate that they've compensated for that impedance, perhaps by removing the piles so they got longer spans. And
okay, I would request that it not be implicit, but that it be explicit in the policy, so people know that it's not just what's on the paper, but it's the whole plan. That's on both of those. Then we think that generally also there's a weakness, and it goes a little bit to what Gary was talking about, but in terms of for the purposes of the co-equal goals, there needs to be more coordination between the levee and ecosystem discussion, we believe, and that it shouldn't just be considered. We will consider environment.
Consider what?
In the general discussion of the levee activities, do
you want to also consider water reliability?
Well, yes, but the point is that the discussion sort of seems to give the ecosystem component of doing levee work and the prioritization of levees and how you do your maintenance and everything else. It sort of just leaves the environment some short shrift. So all we're just saying is look at that and buff that up a little bit. It doesn't get into the ecosystem benefits of doing some of this work.
I don't. It's an interesting point, but I don't. Could you give us some language so Joe and the staff could look at that?
We'll get on that. Yeah.
That would,
Sounds
we would
like
appreciate
linkage language.
Yeah, it's a
in many ways.
linkage stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not a huge criticism. It's just
No, I understand, but I
buff it
do.
up.
I want to. I think we
Yeah,
want to see specific.
we'll get something on
Okay,
that.
Good.
Then, with respect to RRR7, which is the developing criteria for future setback levies, we'd just like to request that you specifically add stakeholder participation to the conversation, not just the agencies. And while you are a state entity, the Corps is not mentioned, nor is the USGS, which we think would be particularly important for this. And so just think it would be good to add those. And then related to the whole prioritization thing, we very much appreciate the fact that the council stepped up on that. I think you did that in the last draft, but so you're going to do that.
Yeah.
But we're concerned that there's the recommendation about a new assessment district in the Delta and the executive order, and that would sort of happen before the prioritization was done. We think the prioritization has to be the first step. And particularly,
wait. Why would you want to deny to Delta counties the right or ability, should the legislature grant them the authority to do so, and the governor agree, to form an assessment district they control for current flood control purposes?
if that's what it's intended for, that's fine. But if it's an assessment district to go figure out a way to fund everything, not just the local.
Well, it is
stuff.
true. Mr. Machado will recommend that the assessment district, the local district of the 5 counties,
Right.
include all the boundaries of the state water project, but not as voting members, simply as people to be
Sure.
assessed.
Exactly.
No doubt he'll say that.
And the assessment
but,
should also
putting
look at
aside
supplement
that
local
idea,
resources.
Right, and acknowledging that we have an interest in what's done in the Delta, and that we have an obligation to pay for benefits we receive. And in that conversation,
I think you ought to be careful about a suggestion that implies we should not proceed with Delta
that was not
control
my.
and self-assessed activities for risk reduction within the Delta until we have resolved levy standards, which have implications for
no.
payment from water users. That doesn't make
It's
a lot
not
of
even the
sense.
standard question. It's what are we spending money on? Whose money is being spent on it? There's limited resources, and in terms of the district, what the suggestion is not to eliminate it. If the intent is to have it focus, is to describe it better in terms of what it is intended to do.
Let me see
certainly
some-
no objection to the local. I mean, it makes sense if that.
Let's see some language so we can talk about something specific.
Well, okay.
Greg,
All
come
right.
on.
And then in relation to for example, the executive order, and sort of we read that as saying have all the agencies figure out what they have in the Delta and set aside money to protect it. We think that may be inconsistent with the notion of the infrastructure corridors that have been out there as a possibility. I mean, if you're going to start spending money to protect things that are sort of out there and then you're going to move them anyway, we need to kind of have that figured out. Again, it's sort of getting the plan in place before you decide what you're going to spend money on, ideally. That's the intent behind that. And related to that is right now you have the prioritization plan with a target of January 2015 as the date for
That's
getting
the
that done.
investment strategy
Right.
recommended the state, which will include
Right, which we appreciate everything that's in there and everything else, but we would suggest that ideally maybe you can get it done by January 2014, and maybe even.
Could we add an amendment that BDCP should be completed by the end of this year, just to kind of wrap everything up?
You asked for reaction and feedback.
All right.
If you don't think it can be done earlier, that's fine. We're thinking that it might be able to be done earlier, and we think this is an important issue, not just for the co-equal goals, but for public safety in the Delta, which is a major issue. We think, it makes sense to look at whether it can be done sooner. The Central Valley folks have done a lot. DWR has done a lot. The locals have done a lot. Does it need to wait 2 years before you can get the plan done? 2.5 years. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Kohler.
This, again, is not a piece of the Delta plan that EDF has had the ability to spend a lot of resources on. I do want to say that in general, having reviewed the chapter, we concur with the staff's overall approach and the recommendations. Consistent with some of the other comments, and this is really just a suggestion, it's not a criticism. I think integrating a little more robustly the connections between floodplain, Joe knows where I'm going, floodplain restoration for environmental purposes and the safety issues in this chapter, I think would be important, sort of breaking down the silos a little bit and showing where there's synergy there between broader ecosystem restoration and the public safety issues. And then I'll just note that, once again, with the science issues that are listed, my prior recommendation about coming up with an integrated approach to bringing scientific information into agency decision-making would also be useful here. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Machado.
Thank you. A couple comments. First grade on integrated management. Having had some experience in the establishment of integrated water management programs, one of the things, and I think it's a great thing to do because what it does, it leads to a more efficient allocation of resources. But the problem which you end up in trying to implement something like that is that you have to overcome local turf barriers. And that's one of the discussions that we had at the commission.
Even regional and statewide turf barriers on occasion.
We can, or federal, but in the Delta, the idea of a regional assessment district was proposed to the commission to allow a look into it, and there was substantial pushback. Everybody was in favor of the concept so long as they didn't lose anything. And in order for that to work, you're going to have to look at prioritizing where you can get the most effective benefits so that the system as a whole improves. And I think that goes back, it follows into what we talked about, the question of Rick, of looking at economic assessments. I think in the discussion that the department is having about economic assessment, we're looking at reinventing the wheel rather than ignoring what experts have said in terms of how you look at the Delta. In the technical memorandum that the department put out, in addition to the ESP and the peer review that this council put to the ESP, it was said that we should be looking at the levee system as a system that is, and the emphasis should be on the performance of the system rather than looking at the probability of failure of any individual islands. And I think that's important. I think we lose that in the look at the economic analysis on an individual basis, because what you end up doing is focusing on the value within the island, but not looking at the total benefits that are gained by the island being a part of a system. And that is not only flood protection, but things like conveyance, habitat, repulsion of salinity, avoidance of increased evaporative losses, on, that come about because an island is protected to a certain level, and not necessarily looking at it individually and where the ag production value may not justify the type of investment. And when we try to separate regional or site from the system, it seems to be more a reaction to financial limitations rather than the definition of the issues and the challenges that are needed to overcome to garner cooperation and participation to address the greater problem. I also think, too, that the idea of promoting an HMP standard is reaction to is really a consideration to ensure financial participation by the federal government in the event of a flood. And the HMP standard is an interim FEMA standard. And it was intended to be an interim standard, and it has not been adjusted to subsequent projected flood elevations. And just this week, a DWR engineer acknowledged that a levee built to an HMP standard could be built out of feathers as long as it met a geometric criteria. I would submit that a levee constructed out of feathers would be insufficient. And I think a feather standard for the Delta does not address the charge put to the plan of trying to define protection for property, people, etc. Rather that we should be looking at a standard that has a engineering criteria. And the difference is that HMP doesn't have a material standard associated with it. It's a geometric standard to be of so much height above a 100-year flood to be able to qualify. Where PL 8499 is, PL 8499 has standards related to peat soils, but in addition to just doing that standard, because it not necessarily meet a 100-year minimum flood protection, we ought to be looking at PL 8499 and a minimum 100-year flood protection, and that, I believe, would be more enduring standard for the Delta levees. Where we have HMP deficiencies, we should be looking at a way to build our way through the deficiencies of HMP to get to a PL 8499. I think by setting that standard, you also address some of the hurdles related to investment into the Delta economy. And if you get to a 100-year flood standard and you look at PL 8499, I think that helps address some of the other restrictions that come in to impede private investment.
Is there anything you know in law that prohibits property owners from increasing their own flood protection to those levels?
No, not at all. And in some of the developments that have taken place in urbanizing areas, they stepped back from what were either project levies or other levies, built their own levies to a higher standard, and proceeded to do development.
If there are no current prohibitions on it happening, then it's probably either a preference or largely financial inability of some property owners to bring the standards up.
And I think that's true, and that's a question that needs to be addressed in terms of the financing. But does the state really want to be an advocate of a feather standard for levee protection in the Delta?
Well, is the state currently legally obligated to pay the cost or any or all of the cost of levee improvements within the Delta today?
No, it participates, except for project levies, and it participates within subvention funds, and part of the reason for the
and
HMP
subvention fund
has
is
been...
a discretionary program, is it not?
That's right. But part of the problem has been, over the 20 years that they've tried to improve HMP deficiencies, money has been granted without accountability in the allocation of that money to directly affect the HMP deficiency. And I think, again, that we get back to this effectiveness, following through, and accountability.
Mike, we've talked about this a lot before.
Yes, and you haven't addressed my issues.
I get to do it again. The setting of state standards for a local area without a clear statement that the state assumes financial liability is the way we've kind of developed things like the discretionary flood program in the state of California. But the reality is kind of a sham, isn't it? Because really all the interested parties say if the state says it should be at this level, well, hell, you just beat them over the head till they give you money to do it.
Well, is that why we're going to a lesser standard, because it'll be cheaper for the state to get there?
No, as you know, when the lands that are now within the Delta were part of the California version of the 1840 Arkansas Act, the provision was that the property owners had to maintain the property against flood risk. It didn't say anything about either the federal government or the state doing it. The burden was placed on the property owners. And that's recognized in this statute as one of the findings. But we've created a different political climate where the expectation is that desired things, if you work hard enough, lobby hard enough and all that, become real, and therefore the state's obligated. If the state passes a law that says the Department of Water Resources and Gary Bardini specifically are personally responsible for levy payments for thus and such, that's an enforceable agreement. The law might be changed at some time in the future, but it's a real deal. Before you get there, I am concerned about the notion that we back in to financial commitments for the state at a time where the state is no better positioned to pay for these conditions, unless they are clearly and explicitly and demonstrably tied to the co-equal goals in a way that science, engineering, and the accumulation of evidence shows that it is desired to do so. And then and only then, do you start talking about setting standards and appropriating money.
Mr. Chair,
Joe?
I would like to add that, in fact, the plan doesn't set a standard. What it does do is prioritize state investments, and that was the charge that was given to the council in the law. And when we get to the point where the council believes it has the information perhaps to set a standard, maybe the council would engage in that. Right now, the charge is, okay, where would you invest money first? And so what the council says is first emergency response and all of that. We have that in there. Then we talk about urban areas, and the way funding is done, you have some funding that's dedicated for urban areas. We think that's clearly a top priority in the Delta, and we want to continue that. And then we say go to HMP. Now, I'm told by the program manager that they believe that everybody that is going to get up to HMP will do that within this next round of funding. And I hope that's the case. That's inconsistent. We've had different information come from different people over the many months, over the last year or year and a half, about what that will be. But it seems clear to me that a recommendation that first you get there, because that does provide increased protection. The feather standard sounds nice, but the reality of HMP is at least we're talking about making improvements over the current system, and then you figure out, okay, where do we go from here? Our estimate in this is 2 years to figure out what the next step is, so I don't think that's unreasonable. I also don't think that the plan prohibits spending money on 8499 levies as you move ahead. In fact, that's what my attorney and staff all advise me, and that may be something we need to clarify, that clearly if you funded all of the HMP stuff and you have, I know there are islands where they partly upgraded to 8499 and they have significant benefits. There's nothing here that says you can't do that. It does, however, say the priorities are different, and that is the charge of the law. And the charge in the law is not to set the standard, and so I want to be because that's a very different thing. If the council set a standard, that would be a very serious undertaking.
Often overlooked too, I think, is one of our two objectives here. One is to reduce the risk of damage, but the other is to promote resilience. And because the HMP makes us eligible for federal funds in the event of a disaster, while it may not be the standard we would like to be able to reduce the risk of damage, it certainly is the first level we need to get to promote some resilience. And then beyond that, if we can get to the PL 8499, we get more resilient, because then we've got the assistance of the Corps of Engineers in rebuilding levees. And each time we step up a little bit on the level of protection, too. But it's certainly a first thing we need to accomplish.
I can accept the priority of investment to be overcome the HMP, but I think the perception is it becomes a de facto standard. And
well, then that's why I wanted to say very clearly it is not the standard. It is.
That's not what the implication is that you'd get out of this chapter.
Well, I think we tried to make that clear, so maybe we need to clarify that further.
Mr. Rentz.
Given the hour, I have a very short comment to make. It's just, I recall when you had a panel come talk to you, what was about 12 months ago, I guess, on this issue of dealing with the levees and flood control and everything. I stepped up to the mic and commented that I was, because it was not an issue that I had tracked that in any detail, I was surprised with the lack of integration, coordination, and that there wasn't, in my mind, there wasn't even an overall strategy. So that being said, I look at lines 26 and 27 on 261, and I go back to page 261. I go back to a comment you made earlier, Felicia, when we were talking about water quality, is when you said, should water quality be one of the priorities for the IIC? And given the significance of what the fallout could be of a failure to have a good strategy in play and implement it. I just lay that question back to you. Is maybe this a priority for the IIC? I don't know. You all need to deliberate, but I wanted to plant that with you. I also, there are a lot of issues that Mike raised and others raised. When we made our comments, we also said there's other venues where those very similar set of issues had been addressed and resolved over time, and they were not easy issues. In my experience, as I mentioned to you all, was when they developed the interagency fire response program, a national program. All the same issues: jurisdiction, costs, allocation of liability, et cetera, were all issues that had to be addressed in that program. So there are some models out there to look at. So I'll stop at that point because I know the hour's getting late for you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Zuckerman.
Well, I don't really care that the hour is getting late because this is a subject that is of immense importance. And I've done my level best over the last year or so to try to get the concerns of the Delta and the Delta engineers and so forth resolved through the drafting of this plan. And we haven't gotten there yet. It's been very frustrating. I've only been able to reach the conclusion that there's a problem at your level, not at the staff level, that is obstructing the resolution of this issue. By way of background, what you've heard from me before, that about the only area in which we've made any measurable progress in the last 20 years in the Delta is in strengthening levees. We have done a very poor job of protecting the ecosystem. We haven't done much about developing water reliability, but we have, through dint of cooperation between numerous local agencies with programs that we've supported and funded through bond elections and so forth, we've made serious progress in this area. It isn't based upon recognizing an inferior configuration of levees as the place where we ought to be stopping with this stuff. And the implication of your plan, the way you have it right now, is you're going to add another level of bureaucratic obfuscation, if you will, to this program by not recognizing that efforts by local districts, levy districts, to achieve PL 8499 is consistent with your plan. And the way it's written now, it's the opposite of that. It would give anybody the right to come in and challenge a district's efforts to go forward to try to reach an acceptable level of protection because it's not deemed consistent with your plan. You must do that. You must do that.
It's not enough to say districts are, under current law, able to proceed at their own expense to develop levy standards that give them the protection they and their customers believe are required. That is not sufficient to say that.
You're a better lawyer than that, Phil. You understand that using that language implies that if you wanted to use the existing programs that are funded by bonds and so forth, that you would, at that point, no longer be consistent.
But you're asking us, Tom, to take all the non-project levies in the Delta and to essentially say that the state does have a financial obligation of some kind at some point that will be implemented at...
Did I say that?
Yeah, I think you did. Because I think that's the only way to understand the comment.
No. We have an existing program. It's been reviewed by the legislature several times.
The subvention program.
And the special projects program. It's been reviewed by special commissions that were put together to say what is the fair way of spreading the cost between the local benefits and those benefits of levies that accrue broadly to the state of California. The Delta plan recommends a continuation of the subvention program. But it does not recommend its conversion from a discretionary program to an entitlement program. It's not what we're talking about. The language that you talk about implies that any time there was going to be state money involved, it would not be consistent with the Delta plan. That's the language that you just gave me orally. And I've seen that language before in discussions.
Language? Give me the page on that one.
You said as long as there is no public money involved.
policy that sets levy priorities is on 271. Yeah, the policy that talks about how levy priorities would be set for state investments is on page 271 and 72. And so it begins with a commitment to develop a long-term prioritization, work together with DWR. That would include, just to get back to some of Mr. Machado's points, a consideration of system-wide integrity. You can see that as the final bullet. You'll recall when Hank helped us develop this list of what would be the priorities the factors we would consider in setting long-term priorities. And then it concludes on page 272. It concludes with a set of interim priorities that would be followed prior to the completion of this overall evaluation. That applies, as you read the last section, to discretionary state investments in Delta flood risk management. So as Joe pointed on, there's nothing here that actually sets a standard for what's the appropriate kind of levy to have in the Delta. It just says, in terms of state investments, here's what we're going to emphasize in the next couple of years.
And staff did not include the suggestion that this study would also deal with cost-sharing ratios, correct?
Yeah, this doesn't look at the finance questions. It just looks at what would be the priorities for investment. We deal with the finance once we understand that.
That's an admission that's incomprehensible to me.
I think that's inherent when you do this kind of study that finances are involved. You can't, in the end, allocate the benefits, which is a key part of what we're looking at, without looking at finances, although the study may make recommendations that may not be final. I cannot see a way for us to recommend priorities for state investment without addressing finance issues. So I would say that that is a part of what's inherent in actually evaluating this, is saying, okay, we get this much benefit for the state as a whole. Here's general practices for how you allocate that. Here's the benefit that we think accrues locally. Here's the benefit to Caltrans. Here's the benefit to the contractors for exports. And you actually try and figure out a methodology. I acknowledge it's very difficult, but in the end, I believe that's fundamentally where we have to go as we're prioritizing, and from prioritizing comes funding. I mean, it's a priority for funding that we're working on. So
the problem with what's being proposed by the Department of Water Resources in the current version of its framework agreement, which is not final yet, it's never really been discussed publicly. There's some meetings starting on that right away. Is the burden upon an individual levy district to try to do some sort of a study that would take into all the factors that Mr. Bardini talked about is overwhelming. You couldn't do that. You can't ask an individual district to hire consultants that are looking statewide at various benefits and costs and available funds and so forth. There needs to be, at least on an interim basis, some recognition that we can continue to move forward with the progress that we're making now towards PL 8499, regardless of whether we're getting state funding or not. And then let us work out with the Department of Water Resources on some sort of an interim basis how they're going to administer these programs. But don't roll logs at us, at obstacles that we can't get across because we can't meet your plan standards.
We've looked a little bit at this over the last couple of weeks, in part because we realized through conversations with Gil Cascio and others that we had misunderstood because of a compilation error that some information had been given with us. The number of levies, the miles of levies in the Delta that need to be brought up, improved to meet HMP standards, the miles of levies that are below HMP now. And we had been told that it was 395 miles. It's really more like 136 miles. So it may mean we don't need to expend quite as much money to get to this second tranche in the priority levels that we've identified here, or the third tranche, bringing everything up to PL 8499. And that might mean additional funds are available for investment in bringing levies up beyond the HMP standard at PL 8499. In our discussions with Mr. Zuckerman, he's talked about the districts that are working hard to move beyond that and not to interfere with that progress. We've asked DWR about that, and they've identified about a dozen districts, 12 of the 93 RDs in the Delta, who are in the middle of substantial programs to improve their levies from HMP to PL 8499. Those districts have received about $63 million already, so that's an investment that's already been made in this effort. And they're in various states of progress, some ranging from as little as 10% of their levies that still would need to be upgraded to get to 8499, to others who have only made about 10% of the progress towards there. So somewhere in there you can say, okay, yeah, we don't want to strand this investment that's gotten us partway there. Other times you might think, well, wait a minute, are we just putting good money after bad? Let's figure this out. So I think we can bring you back an alternative that would you could consider next week or in 2 weeks that would identify that another category of priorities would be continuation of programs for investment in levies that are on RDs that are partway towards from HMP to PL 8499 to 8499, so they can complete that process, or an alternative that sounds like Mr. Zuckerman is suggesting that funds be available if these other priorities have been fulfilled to bring everybody to 8499, and you could consider those choices and see how you wanted to do it.
I want to point out that there is a limitation on funds, which we cite in the chapter. I think it's $120-some million remaining in bond funds available for this purpose, and we actually do in the chapter on page 270 on lines 36 through 39 explicitly say that it is consistent that if agencies want to continue working on levies and bring them up beyond HMP standard, that they can do that. So the real issue is, okay, we have these limited funds remaining. Where should the funds be expended? And the experts on that really, in terms of how much funding we have and how much work remains to be done, are Gary and the Department of Water Resources. And as I understand it, there's not enough money remaining to bring everybody up to PL 8499. If we add that as a priority for funding, even though it may not be a commitment by the state, it will be seen by many as a commitment by the state to upgrade everyone to that standard. I just think that we have to be careful about going to that step. And nobody's really done the full system analysis that we're talking about doing over the next couple of years, so you can make intelligent decisions. It may in fact be that there are some levies in the Delta that need more than PL 8499 that are currently not project levies, and it may in fact be that there are other areas that really and truly don't need that, and so the state should prioritize where it spends its money. So I just think that is the responsibility of the council, and I understand the desire for the council to commit, yes, fund PL 8499, but
Mr. Nordhoff.
Not what we're asking.
That's not what it's asking.
Well, stop. Mr. Nordhoff. You okay? Okay, go ahead. Mike, whatever.
No, I don't think that's what people are asking.
Right.
What people prioritize state money that's available to bring HMP deficiency up is fine. But what does the Delta plan define as a state of levies, state for the levies to provide the optimal protection for property, life, infrastructure, etc.? And is that
the language is for state interests in the Delta? Life, property, and state interests in the Delta under the statute.
Do people in the Delta constitute a state interest?
Life, property, and state interest in the Delta is the way the law is written, Mike.
But what is not state interest in terms of
come on,
the
that's an argument.
Okay,
that
but
the state should pay for anything.
Nobody's talking about this. No, we're not talking. It's not what we're talking about.
Okay, so
because there is a funding problem that has to be dealt with, and it's not going to. It can't continue to come from the assessments from the RDs in anticipation of subvention funds. that's been a debate that's been going on in the legislature now for several decades and hasn't been resolved. And we're coming to a limit on that, just as Mr. Pardini talked about, in terms of the resources and the back off, whether it be at the federal level or the state level. But what we're implying, what we're mixing is how do we spend money versus how do we address the overall protection for the in Delta and those associated with the Delta in the end. And then the question comes back in, how do you fund it? And do you change that paradigm? And it's suggested in the plan that paradigm ought to be changed by looking at a broader assessment district to be able to attach to beneficiaries, and that word in some is a term of art, to participate in trying to get there. But we seem to be trunching this to a point where we're either going to look at an individual island based on its individual economics, or we're going to look at just the prioritizing of state money, which I don't think anybody will take issue with, but I think you have to look at this broader perspective too as to where you're going to go and how you're going to get there.
I wanted to correct one other statement. The list that Dan has, I talked briefly with Joe about yesterday, and I think he got it from DWR based upon 5-year plans that had been submitted. The problem with the list is that the 5-year plans are supposed to be submitted by the end of this month, and that happens to be the list of the people that had already submitted them. But
this was a list of those districts who were currently but are received funds to upgrade from H&P to PL 8499. So if the argument is we're going to strand investment, people are in the middle of a program, these are the districts that have already received funds and are in the middle of a program to upgrade their levies from H&P to PL 8499.
But the point I wanted to make is every levy district in the Delta that I'm aware of is striving to reach 8499. That's been the policy of the state. It's a federal policy and so forth, and that's been what we're trying to do. Don't pull that rug out from underneath us.
Randy has a question, then Don.
Mike and Tom, what part of RRP1 doesn't address your concern? On page 271.
The problem that we have with it is that it implies that nothing's going to happen for 3 years. Was this whole thing part of RRP?
Yes, the whole thing. Goes over to the next page.
Well, let me put it this way, because I'm getting confused by your question, but we've had discussions with staff, extensive discussions. Last one, Mr. Ray was involved in for the first time. And we've pointed to the language that we thought needed to be corrected in the text to eliminate the implications that we're talking about. And there's been less discussion about the RRP1 than there was about other parts of the text that we're talking about. I could go into that in some length, but I don't think I need to bother you at this point. Your staff is well aware of the conversations and what it is that we're seeking to change.
Well, I guess I hear your concern about limiting the level of protection, but I don't see any of that in RRP1. I see this as an attempt to prioritize how the limited funds should be spent, left up to the discretion of the local RDs to employ that and to come up with some form of matching funds. So as I look at this, what I'm asking specifically is, what's wrong with this? What is it that doesn't address your concerns?
I can't read a page of small print in 5 seconds. Okay?
I can maybe answer what they have suggested before. If you go to page 270, and it's not in the policy language itself. What they actually suggested was where we say that efforts by landowners and other parties to perform levee upgrades beyond those funded by the state, what they would rather see is a statement that says efforts to upgrade levees, including those funded by the state, are not inconsistent with the Delta plan. So they want to make it clear that it's consistent with the Delta plan to spend state money upgrading the levees to PL 84-99.
Okay, then why not say that?
And I think sometimes it is consistent, and sometimes it may not be consistent. If you go through the priorities, then it is consistent, but that's the point of the priority system, to say go through these priorities, and at least based on our conversations with the Department of Water Resources, it will be consistent within the next year to do that. So in that case, it would be fine. It's just a matter of we don't want to imply that it's okay to go build everybody's or build some people's levees up to PL 8499 if the emergency preparedness function is not funded, or if funding to bring all the levees up to HMP is not in place. So we want the priority system. I think that's the direction that you gave us, actually, was set priorities and bring that back.
Yeah, but
So
Actually, the legislation gave us that.
Yes, the legislation gave us that.
well,
direction.
it gave us that. We're not going to do it for a number of years, really.
Well, we're actually putting in place interim priorities. We
That's
should
about-
do it immediately.
Here's what I'm trying to understand. You all are having a conversation that many of you have had. I know we've had conversations here. I know Tom's frustrated. I know the chairman's frustrated because he is reacting to things that I'm not hearing Tom say, and vice versa. So it's, again, like you guys are having some weird conversation, but those of us who haven't been in it. So help me understand. I need to understand. I'm trying really hard, and I do not understand what we're keeping you from doing, and whether it's an issue of you being afraid of an implication, much as in the WRP1, where there's fear of an extreme, or whether there's an actual mechanism that would hurt you from doing something.
Joe and I sat together in his office perhaps a year ago, and I scratched out some language which I recall saying efforts by local levee districts to build levees to PL 8499 standards will not be deemed inconsistent with the Delta plan. Didn't have anything to do with funding or anything else. And I understood at the time that language was going to be in the next draft of the plan. And it isn't. And instead there's other language which has a different implication, and you could certainly reach different conclusions from it. So I don't know why that language isn't in here unless it's something that got discussed at the council level and rejected somewhere. I don't know. I haven't had this conversation with the chairman. It's been with the staff.
And I think it's just an attempt to clarify what we were saying, at least what I thought our discussion with Tom was. And I'm certainly willing to say that building levees up to PL 8499 is consistent with the plan. What we don't want is the implication that it's on the priority list for states.
Well, then, can we just say that as opposed to, I hate dealing with implications at all on this, or when you all say, like in the earlier thing, well, if you read this other section, it's unlikely that it would happen. I think just say it clearly and avoid the fear.
But we'll go back and make sure that that is clearly articulated.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Zlotnick
Just
and
a,
Mr.
just a
Michaud.
question on what I think I heard was that any local activity to upgrade the levees to whatever will not be inconsistent with the plan. Is that any different than basically providing an exemption from covered action consistency for any activity undertaken related to the levees?
No, because it depends where it was located, because certainly we have other policies in the plan that, for example, would control the improvement of a levee that was going to interfere with the opportunity for ecosystem restoration. We've identified these areas as an example.
Okay.
And so other policies of the plan would kick in that would shape how that was done.
Okay. Well, however you write it up, I hope that's included.
Mr. Machado.
The perspective that I present as reflective of the Commission is we ought to be looking at the Delta Islands as part of a system of protection that it provides. And the policy here indicates looking at it on an island-by-island basis. Publications that have been referenced look at it from the economic value within the island, and not necessarily associated with other benefits that accrue because there's levee protection around that island. And so emphasis ought to be made to look at the system of levees and the protection it applies. And why is that important? Because in some ways that would be an impediment to other policies to policies that are being considered to be proposed by others. And I think it's an important aspect of the Delta integrity to be able to view the Delta as a system of protection and the array of benefits that occur from that.
Mr. Nordhoff.
First of all, 3 cheers for Felicia for cutting through all of the vagueness and the haze and all the rest of that. I think that was fantastic. Really, my admiration for you has increased immeasurably. Now, the second thing, I guess in some ways it's easier for me to deal with this because I don't have the years and years of baggage and innuendo that many of us have here. We have striven from the very beginning to make this as explicit as possible so you wouldn't have to imply something or somehow ascribe intentions that weren't really intended. And I think we ought to try to do that. Now, I've heard nothing at all in anything that Tom has said or Mike or anybody else that is at variance with what we're trying to do. Now, you said. I think this policy is pretty damn good given what we have. I think it's pretty much complete. I think we can add a couple qualifiers here or there, but I think the guts of it is pretty damn good. And all we're doing right now, it seems to me, without all the baggage, is messing around at the periphery of some of these important concepts. I think it's a waste of time.
Okay. All right. Don.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Since I was going to ask a question on some of the discussions evolved here, so I'm going to be brief. But I do think that some of the points that have been made by a number of speakers, including my fellow council members, I think really focus in on the essence of this matter. And I think that Tom and Mike have clearly delineated, certainly from the Commission's viewpoint, I think from a landowner and in a broader Delta perspective, Tom and others have represented that. And it would, again, there may still be a difference here, but I guess from the standpoint of what Felicia said, if there's simple language and if it's, the difference between what our staff brings to us based upon some previous council direction versus the discussion here today, I'd like to see that for a couple of weeks from now because I think this point is pivotal, and whether it's embedded in RRP1, which becomes policy, it becomes enforceable. It may speak to a lot of the prioritization and so forth. But I think the points of system integrity and PL 8499 and any discouragement or lack of consistency, again, we can debate the finer points, but I'd like to see some simple language, and if there's a difference between what staff recommends and what others would feel would provide that opportunity and not compromise necessarily the discussion that will continue to be ongoing for decades as to how to fund and finance, but not everything in the Delta gets raised all at one time. Folks need to be able to proceed under the programs that are available to them and not be hampered by what we're trying to do here in the Delta plan. And I don't necessarily think that's the intent, and I think Joe and Dan have shed some light on that. But for 2 weeks from now, I'd like to see, again, whatever you scribed out 12 months ago, Tom, or something facsimile. Mike, I think simply boiling down what the Commission certainly recommended to the ESP, but I think this whole thing about system-wide integrity is mentioned in one of the bullet points in RRP1, but as to simply boil that down, and then obviously what Joe and Dan would bring in their analysis, because I think from the standpoint of this council and any viewpoints that are represented here and in the audience, this is going to be a very pivotal point for the entire plan, I believe, and we need to clearly have whatever the choices are before us.
Let's do this. We have to close anyway because the DVD is about to run out, and the recording, which we post on our website, that will take 10 minutes to change. I think what we ought to do is take our break now for 30, 35 minutes, and then come back to get public testimony. Mr. Gardner is the only one who's to date has indicated his testimony. Other things, then wrap it up, and then go to our next panel. I apologize for the delay. Hank.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. The two of us have to leave. We won't be around after you resume following the break. I would like to say something that's probably going to shock a lot of people, but Greg Zolnick and I agree on something.
Uh-oh.
I find it unconscionable to wait until January 1st, 2015 to implement these priorities. I can not sit here and think of any reasons why it should take 2.5 years to do that. We seem to aim pretty low on things like this, and we don't seem to meet the guidelines very well either, and that's a bad combination. If we aim low and we blow the guidelines, that doesn't bring a lot of glory on this group and what we've been trying to do. So I'd like to hear some of the reasons why it's going to take 2.5 years to implement this thing. And if we don't get valid reasons, move it up to a more realistic
Just a
date.
note, Mr. Nordhoff will not be here after lunch, Joe, but I think one of the things you ought to come back to 2 weeks from now is a focus on the timeline needed and the elements. We've got an outline here, which is based on your comments, 4 meetings ago or something like that. We have a structure here, but we need to get an evaluation of time and the explanation of why it's going to take that long.
And what I will do is ask staff who worked some on getting this done to get together with DWR and look at the specifics of how long it will take to implement this. We don't wait to implement the prioritization that's already in there. We have an interim prioritization. That's immediate. So, but to do the studies for the more detailed work, that's
Okay.
what the time's for.
All right. We got to stop because I've gotten the sign from our technical crew that we're running out of space. Okay, we are going to resume the discussion at 1:45, very briefly on this chapter, and then move to the financing chapter.
Say 145?
145.